Whoa, that was quick. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. This is our weekly Wednesday weather get together. It is Wednesday, June 20th, 2018, and we are quickly approaching on the end of the month. So tonight we have Dr. Phil Klotzbach on with us from Colorado State University. He is a tropical weather expert, and as you know, we like to talk about the tropics here. And tonight we're going to be looking at the outlook for it, the tropical seasons, to get Phil's take on what he feels like will be happening. So we are glad that you are joining us tonight. If you do have any questions throughout the show, you can do that one of many ways. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Carolina WX Group, or you can leave a comment on the Facebook Live or Periscope feed. And if you're listening to the podcast, maybe later on in the week or a few days from now, we'll let Phil share his social media information towards the end of the show, and you can tweet some questions towards him. So Phil is on a tight schedule tonight, so we're going to skip the weather roundtable for right now. We may do that towards the end of the show, but I'm going to bring in Shay Gibson, our resident tropical expert. And Shay, I'll let you start off the show tonight.
Thank you, Scotty. Yeah, we do have Dr. Phillip Klotzbach in with us tonight, and very exciting show because he's what many consider a lead scientist. In fact, he's research scientist in the Department of Atmospheric Science, and he works with Colorado State University. So we have him on tonight. He comes out with annual predictions for the hurricane season. His last one was May 31st, and we're going to touch base with him to find out what his new take on it is and when the next update may be and what the outlook is going to be for the rest of the hurricane season. So without more than that, I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Dr. Phillip. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and we'll dive right into the topic for tonight.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Shane and Scotty. Thanks so much for having me on the program. I'm Phil Klotzbach. I work in the Atmospheric Science Department at Colorado State. I worked for about 15 years with Dr. Bill Gray, who is the father of seasonal hurricane prediction, and I could spend hours telling you all sorts of Bill Gray stories. He was a brilliant scientist. He did a lot of work with the seasonal forecast, but he also did fundamental work on tropical cyclone genesis, intensity, structure, and if any of you ever got a chance to meet him, he certainly was a character as well. We actually published a paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society last November that has an article on discussing kind of his research legacy. But I work with Dr. Gray a lot in the seasonal forecasts, and I started working with him in 2001 on the forecast. So I work with him through his death in 2016, and now I'm currently the lead author on the seasonal forecast along with my colleague Michael Bell. Work out at CSU. A lot of people want to know why the heck are you doing seasonal forecasts in Colorado? And the answer is the storm surge can't get you at 5,000 feet. But no, seriously, the reason why hurricanes have been a focus at CSU for a long time is because the guy who started our department, his name was Herbert Reel, who actually came from the University of Chicago, which is still nowhere near hurricanes. And he was asked to start our department in the early 1960s. And when he came out to start the department, he had brought some of his hurricane people, and Dr. Gray was finishing off his Ph.D. at the time. So he came out a few years later to work with Herbert Reel. And when Dr. Gray passed away, we actually found the original offer letter that Herbert Reel had sent to Dr. Gray back in 1964. Dr. Gray never got rid of anything. We found a lot of interesting stuff in his office after cleaning up. He'd been in the same office for 48 years. So definitely a lot of bleach and stuff needed to clean up his office for Michael, who's now working in his office. But that's what I do. I do the seasonal hurricane forecast. I'm interested in hurricanes on timescales from day to day to weekly, monthly, seasonal, and beyond to multi-decadal and climate change timescales. I'll show my social stuff at the end, but I'm pretty active on Twitter. I try to post a lot of, I'm a kind of a stats guy, so I like to post a lot of statistics about the hurricane season and tropical cyclone activity, not just in the Atlantic, but globally. But now let's go on. I just wanted to share a few slides today. So we're going to share our screen, and I'm going to briefly talk with you about the outlook for the 2018 hurricane season. So the 2018 hurricane season, as all of you well know, started on June the 1st. So our final forecast we put out on May 31st was for a near average season. A total of 14 named storms, one of those being Hurricane Alberto, so 13 additional storms, 6 hurricanes and 2 major hurricanes. Accumulated cyclone energy, which is an integrated index that takes into account the frequency the intensity, and the duration of storms. It's kind of a geeky metric that we like to use. It kind of gives us one number to assess a season. The reason that we like ACE is because you can have a season that has a whole pile of storms. For example, 2013, we had 14 named storms, but of those 14 storms, only 2 became hurricanes. So it was really a dud of a season, even though the number of storms was actually a little bit above the long-term average. So we're predicting a near average hurricane season in late May, and we'll actually be updating our forecast on July 2nd. And with that July update, we'll likely be lowering our numbers significantly, and I'll talk with you a little bit about that in just a minute. So our forecasts use statistical methods and historical data to come up with our predictions. Unlike what some of our critics might say, we're not throwing darts at a board. We're not waking up in the morning like my meteorological namesake, the groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, and seeing if we can see our shadow. We use historical data and historical information to come up with these forecasts. So our current model for June uses a total of 4 predictors, 2 in the Atlantic that are trying to basically assess kind of the state of the large-scale conditions in the Atlantic, and 2 in the tropical Pacific, which are trying to assess the state of El Nino. And El Nino is a very important driver of hurricane activity in the Atlantic. When you have El Nino, which is warmer than normal water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific, it tends to decrease your storm activity in the Atlantic basin. Alternatively, when you have a La Nina, it tends to have more hurricane activity in the Atlantic due to changes in upper level winds, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. So our forecast from early June shows reasonably good skill. Now, these models aren't perfect. You are going to have some years where you bust, and that's just because you're using a statistical model and basing it on historical data, and there's only so many realizations that you have of past hurricane seasons, and there's only so many realizations that we have of kind of how the atmosphere and ocean were behaving. As you go back in time, prior to satellite era in, say, the late 60s, early 70s, the data gets sketchy. The hurricane data isn't as good, as well as the weather data we have for water temperatures and pressures. There are fewer observations, and consequently the data just is less reliable. So consequently, when you're building these models, there's always kind of a push and pull between, do you want to build a model off of more years of data where the data is less reliable, or do you want to build a model on newer data but where you only have fewer realizations? And so that's kind of a battle that we're always weighing when developing our statistical models. So the current forecast for 2018, the tropical Atlantic right now is very cold. I'll talk a lot more about that in a couple of minutes. And we're starting to potentially head towards an El Nino event. NOAA recently came out with an outlook saying that they put out an El Nino watch, and there is a chance that we might reach the El Nino threshold for El Nino by the peak of the hurricane season, which the peak 3 months are August through October. September is the peak month. The Atlantic hurricane season is much more peak than any other tropical cyclone basin. About half of all your accumulated cyclone energy, about half of all your storm activity occurs during the month of September. Now, last year was kind of that example on steroids, where we had over twice the average hurricane season in 1 month just during the month of September. So an incredibly active September last year. But we think we might be headed towards a potential weak El Nino event for the hurricane season. But I think that's going to be a secondary driver of overall storm activity compared with what we have going on in the Atlantic. So
Dr. Klotzbach,
yes, sir.
Quick question. If we could go back to that.
Yes.
Go back to that picture right there. So for our viewers out there, we're talking about El Nino ENSO cycles, and we're getting kind of technical here, but stop for a second and tell us about what's in that box. What constitutes an El Nino versus a La Nina? What the temperature of the water? What is the difference that it makes in order for it to be an El Nino versus La Nina?
Yeah, that's a good point. So when you have an El Nino, so these differences are fairly small when you think about it. So NOAA's official definition of an El Nino is when the water temperatures exceed ½ degree Celsius warmer than normal. And a La Nina is ½ degree Celsius cooler than normal, so about 1 degree Fahrenheit either way. And while, you know, a degree or 2 Fahrenheit doesn't seem like much, it's a lot in the deep tropics. Obviously, in the mid-latitudes, it doesn't play much of a difference, but in the tropics, 1-2 degrees Fahrenheit is a very big deal, can cause big changes in the atmospheric circulation, which is really how El Nino impacts the Atlantic hurricanes. Since obviously you're talking about warm waters in the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic hurricanes obviously form in the Atlantic. Basically what happens is when you have an El Nino event, you end up getting changes in lower and upper level winds. So in the Atlantic, your low level winds always blow out of typically blow out of the east, and your upper level winds blow out of the west. So those low level winds are called the trade winds. These are the winds that blew the explorers over to the New World hundreds of years ago, and they still blow today. When you have an El Nino, you get slightly stronger trade winds, but you get much stronger winds at upper levels, much stronger westerly winds. And consequently, in the vertical, you have what's known as a vertical wind shear. So the change in wind direction with height is quite strong. And basically, hurricanes want to be upright. They want as little shear as possible. Too much shear tilts the hurricane circulation, disrupts the vortex, and you're less able to get the tropical cyclone storms and especially the hurricanes. For example, 2015 was a very strong El Nino and overall very quiet Atlantic hurricane season. And it's not just El Nino. Other factors obviously play an important role in Atlantic hurricane activity as well. But El Nino was one of the original relationships that Dr. Gray discovered back in the early 80s. He used it in his first prediction model in 1984. And most seasonal forecast groups, our group at CSU, NOAA, the UK Met Office, Tropical Storm Risk, all these groups take into account El Nino when putting out their seasonal hurricane forecasts. So here's the latest forecast from the US government. They're up to about a 50% chance of an El Nino for the August through October period. So it's gone up a bit from what they were forecasting in early May. I don't think at this point it's going to be a strong El Nino event, and if the Atlantic was much warmer, we probably wouldn't necessarily play that much of a role. But since the Atlantic is very cold right now, it potentially could have somewhat more of an impact and really knock down the season, even more than what we expect to see from just how cold the Atlantic is right now. Right now, the Pacific Ocean is running a decent amount warmer than normal. This is looking at upper ocean heat content, so not just the water temperatures that are at the surface, but how the waters are slightly below the surface. Because if you have a lot of warmth below the surface, especially in the Central Pacific, that will often tend to come up towards the surface and evidence itself in potentially a weak, maybe even a moderate El Nino event by the time we get to this upcoming winter, and potentially have significant impacts for the United States. Then we have what's going on in the tropical Atlantic. Now, I recently wrote a blog for the Capital Weather Gang from the Washington Post, comparing the 2018 season and the 2017 season. In mid-March, both 2017 and 2018 have very similar water temperature patterns across the tropical Atlantic and the North Atlantic. Overall, it was kind of cold in the North Atlantic, a little bit warm off the East Coast, and a little bit cold in the tropical Atlantic. Well, in 2017, the pressure patterns were very low in the subtropics. In 2018, the pressures were very high. And so when you think about the circulation around a high pressure system, it's clockwise. So on its eastern extent, you have air coming out of the east and out of the north. And basically, when you have air out of the east, it's bringing down colder water. Air out of the north is bringing down colder water and colder air. And the winds tending to blow out of the east means the winds are stronger because your trade winds are going to be stronger. Stronger winds mean more mixing, more evaporation, more upwelling, more churning up of the sea surface. Similarly to the way, if say you get out of a pool on a windy day, you get cold very fast, you get a lot of evaporation, it causes a lot of cooling, a lot of mixing. And consequently, we have very cold water temperatures in the tropical Atlantic right now. So there's a box that we often define called the main development region, which is about 10 to 20 degrees north latitude, 20 to 60 west longitude. This area is where a lot of your major hurricanes form. And right now you see all sorts of blues indicating much colder than normal water in that region. Actually, right now, the water temperatures with the daily anomalies are actually the coldest that they've been going back to 1982, which is when the daily data started. So they're the coldest water temperatures we've seen in the tropical Atlantic in over 30 years. Really quite remarkable. And typically, a colder water is associated with less active hurricane seasons because colder water means less fuel for the storm, since a hurricane's fuel source is warm ocean water. Cooler water means less fuel for the storms, but it also tends to be associated with higher pressure, a more stable atmosphere, more dust outbreaks, more dry air, basically just all sorts of conditions that tend to suppress the hurricane season. So at this point, while our current forecast is for a near average season, likely with our July update, we'll be reducing our forecast considerably because the cold water has been very persistent. Typically in the deep tropics, in the tropical Atlantic, your patterns tend to lock in about mid-July. So once you get into mid-July, if you have cold anomalies in the tropics, they're less likely to go away over the next couple of months. Those strong trade winds tend to weaken climatologically, so you're less likely to get big shifts in weather patterns during the late July through August, September timeframe. The latest forecast from the Climate Forecast System, which is NOAA's model, is calling for a little bit warmer than normal in the tropical Pacific. They're actually going a little more aggressive and potentially calling for a weak to moderate El Nino by August through October. The model is calling for some warming in the tropical Atlantic since you don't see much cold left. But the model's been pretty consistent at calling for a lot of warming, and so far we haven't really seen that. So if you have, say, a weak El Nino combined with a very cold Atlantic, that would likely suppress the hurricane season significantly. So we put out 4 seasonal forecasts. Our first forecast comes out on April 5th. This year it did. We always put out a forecast in early April. We update it late May, early June. Then we update it again in early July, and a final forecast on the 2nd of August. Now, I like to point out that while certainly August 2nd is 2 months into the hurricane season, it's important to note that about 95% of all your major hurricane activity, so the category 3 through 5 hurricanes, comes after the 1st of August. So even though we're 2 months into the season on August 1st, most of your major hurricane activity is still to come. And also by then you have a better idea of how the atmosphere and ocean are behaving. So as you would expect, our forecasts show kind of marginal skill in April, moderate skill in late May, early June, and then good skill in July and August because we're closer to the events that we're trying to predict. And especially our confidence in the El Nino, La Nina forecast goes up considerably by the July into August timeframe. If you're really interested in seasonal forecasts, there's a website. It's a website that we developed at CSU with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center doing the real heavy lifting for this website at seasonalhurricanepredictions.org. We now have over 25 groups submitting seasonal forecasts to this website. So if you're interested in seasonal forecasts, our group at CSU does them, but there's a large number of universities, private sector weather forecasting companies, as well as government agencies also issuing these forecasts. So I definitely invite you to check these out if you're interested in seasonal forecasts. And here's an example of kind of a screenshot from a couple weeks ago showing what the seasonal forecasts were. And there's even more of that out there today, so I invite you to check that out if you're interested in the seasonal forecasts. On the website, we not only have the forecast displayed, but we also have a short discussion basically describing why the forecasts are calling for what they are. And so what I'd like to finish with is just my contact info. So if you're interested in getting in touch with me, I recommend you can always email me. We have a website where we have the seasonal forecast. So when you hear the forecast, you probably just hear, the numbers are, 14 storms, 6 hurricanes, whatever. But on the website, we have, there's a document that goes with each of those forecasts, typically 30 to 40 pages long. We go into great detail describing why we're forecasting what we are, why are we using the models that we are. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, I definitely recommend downloading these. It can help put you to sleep. I do a lot of stuff on Twitter. Definitely follow me on Twitter if you use Twitter. Facebook page is basically a mirror of my Twitter feed. So if you follow me on Twitter, you don't need to follow me on Facebook. In general, I recommend Twitter just because I just mirror Twitter to Facebook, and the animations come out a lot better on Twitter. They don't often post on Facebook. So with that, thanks for paying attention to that, and I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may have arisen during the talk.
All right, well, I guess I'll lead off. That was quite a bit of information. Thank you very much for the slideshows. Excellent, excellent information. So I think a lot of folks are sort of wondering after last year, when are things going to start getting ramped up? And I'll share my screen. There's one thing that you talked about a little bit ago, and that was the TC heat potential, which is tropical cyclone heat potential.
Mm-hmm.
This is the current look, and you can see the main development region, which you showed, is fairly neutral. It doesn't look like there's anything much going on over in this part of the Atlantic Ocean, but the Caribbean is usually a hot spot. And you talked about depth of warm water. The mesopelagic zone, or the epipelagic, mesopelagic zones, for the most part, Mesa is a little bit deeper down. But when we talk about surface water, how important is sea surface temperatures surface-wise for storms to develop in these areas?
Yeah, so so basically, typically with the hurricane season, it really ramps up in August. And what you find if you kind of plot up a map of shear, and I kind of always think of 2 basic things. You have shear and sea surface temperatures are 2 of your primary drivers for hurricane activity. And climatologically, what starts your season is getting the waters warm enough. If you look at storms that form early, they often form in, say, the Gulf of Mexico or Western Caribbean. No surprise, because that's where your heat potential is that time of year. But to get storms forming further east and having these long tracks like Irma's and Maria's and Jose's, the sea surface temperatures need to warm up enough. So in a year like last year, the waters were pretty warm. So the water and temperatures were warm enough to support hurricanes pretty far east in the basin. Sometimes if, say, the waters are colder, those systems can't develop until they get further west. So kind of what typically starts your hurricane season is the water temperatures, and what ends your season is your vertical wind shear getting too strong. So if you look at shear, your shear is actually lowest in the tropical Atlantic in August, late July through August, but the waters aren't really warm enough to really support the storms until later in the season. Now, if you have a very warm tropical Atlantic, sometimes you can get these storms forming earlier in the season. So typically, if you get named storms forming in kind of what I said, that main development region prior to the 1st of August, that's a harbinger of a very, very active season. But it's more of a necessary condition, or a sufficient condition, but not a necessary one, because you can certainly get very active seasons with no storms in the main development region prior to the 1st of August. A recent case in point of that was 2004. We didn't get our first storm that year, Alex, until I believe August the 1st, and it was obviously an incredibly active season. Had the most active September on record until last year, which broke that record from 2004. But yes, as you mentioned before, if you're going to get storms early, they typically form in the Gulf of Mexico, Western Caribbean, or off the U.S. East Coast, kind of where Alberto formed is a classic location for early season storms to form. And that slide perfectly shows the peak of the hurricane season on September 10th. It really starts to ramp up about August 20th. So Dr. Gray used to come in to our tropical weather discussions, which we hold every day from about early July through October. On August 20th, he would come in and ring a bell. And he said, basically, that's signaling the active part of the season. And often that's really the case, is around August 20th, the season really does ramp up. And you certainly saw that even last year, where season we had a few storms, but nothing really of significance. Around August 20th, what had been Harvey started to have some deep convection fire up near it again. A few days later, it was a Category 4, and then it was pretty much all hell broke loose through the end of September.
Phil, one thing that here in the Southeast that we see a lot of is these stalled cold fronts, or these cold fronts that move through and kind of stall off the coast and generate what we call homegrown systems. Do you see a lot of that happening maybe this year with like you were talking about, the deep Atlantic a little bit cooler? We may see storms generate more closer to the coastline?
Yeah, I mean, that can definitely happen often, especially with El Niños. You kind of almost find an opposite relationship where your deep tropical storm activity will get suppressed, but you'll get more of these kind of subtropical, we used to call it like basically junk storms. You know, typically the stuff that forms really close to the coast doesn't have enough time to really get that particularly strong or do that much damage. But I think in these kind of years where, you know, the deep tropics is probably going to be cold and have a lot of shear, you might see some more of these kind of trailing frontal things spinning up. But often, again, these storms don't typically have the significant impacts that we get from storms forming in the deep tropics. Most of your major hurricanes that hit the U.S. form in the deep tropics or Western Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico. Oh, perfect. This is great. So yeah, you can see the prevailing tracks month by month. Again, June, July tends to be more stuff in the deep tropics, the Western Atlantic. And then you see kind of the formation zone shift towards the east in August, and then maximize more in the central Atlantic in September, and then shift back west in October. Typically, if El Nino does develop, El Nino has its strongest impacts on late season storms. So if we were to get an El Nino, I would expect a very quick end to the season in October. It would tend to be very quiet late in the season because El Nino really ramps up your shear. And remember what I said, shear is typically what ends your season. So if you have El Nino, you have more shear, tends to cut off your season early. So typically, El Nino seasons have very little late season storm activity. And especially stuff in the Western Caribbean, which is if you're going to get nasty storms late in the season, that's typically where they're going to come out of, is the Western Caribbean.
Okay, so I have a question for you since I come from emergency management career path. So we're kind of split with how we use these forecasts. Some EMs think it's really important and kind of ramp up based on if you say more or less. And then I've also heard of some that pretty much throw it out the window because they have the philosophy that one is one. If one comes in and it hits you, that's kind of the deal. So how do you want us to use that in applied emergency management, and how can we teach EMs to use this in a way that's the most effective for them to understand for preparedness?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the emergency management, we always basically say, you know, you need to be prepared the same for every hurricane season, since it just takes, you know, that one hurricane near you to make it an active season for you. Obviously, with the seasonal forecasts, they're not perfect. There are some years where the forecast doesn't do well. There are cases where the forecast, Dr. Gray had a great forecast in '92 of only one major hurricane. It just happened to be Hurricane Andrew. So you can have those kinds of situations. With that being said, in general, more active seasons do have more landfalls. I mean, you can kind of pick and choose years where it didn't work out that way, but in general, the odds do go up. And if you have an active season, the odds of landfalls do go up. So I think when it comes to the general public, we say it's an informational tool. People are curious and want to know how active the season is, but you can't say where the storms are going to make landfall. And it's important to prepare the same for every hurricane season. I know a lot of emergency managers that I've talked to basically use it as kind of a hook to say, hey, they just came up with a seasonal forecast. Now's the time to start having a hurricane plan. I mean, I think honestly, when it comes to preparation, this year it's like shooting fish in a barrel because everyone saw what happened last year, so they're freaked out about hurricanes. And it's like 2006. We saw the same thing after 04 and 05 with Katrinas and Ritas and Charlies. Everyone was really fired up and ready for hurricane season. Then you get a few years where hurricanes are a lot less impactful to the U.S. and people kind of get lax. So last year we were talking about hurricane amnesia and getting people fired up. And then we had last year. And so this year it's not going to be an issue. But we actually even saw that with national flood insurance policies. NFIP policies dropped about 20%, I believe, between 2009 and last year. And I guarantee you they spiked right back up after what we just saw. And it was interesting. I saw with Hurricane Harvey, 40% of the houses that flooded in Hurricane Harvey were outside of the 500-year floodplain. That was from the Harris County district. So it's important that even if you don't necessarily live in a 100-year flood zone, your house can still flood. So it's really important, if you live anywhere near any body of water, to definitely consider flood insurance.
Definitely. I agree with all of that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah, you had some amazing stats last year, and you talked about ACE and how much ACE Maria harnessed all in one fell swoop, and how much ACE the Atlantic generated last year. Talk a little bit about what you do statistically, because you put out some amazing information, things that people would never think about. Where do you gather your information from? I mean, do you have like a whole tree that you follow, or how do you generate this information?
Yeah, I mean, I just have a massive spreadsheets with queries that I've written to kind of grab stuff. But yeah, I mean, from doing the seasonal forecast, I've got extensive data actually globally on storms. So I have all the historical weather data, which all comes from the National Hurricane Center, and then I just kind of parse it in ways that I like to make querying really quick. And then sometimes what I'll do is look up stuff and kind of look at the storm and kind of get an idea of if it's going to set a record at a particular time, to try to have stuff ready to go. And then when the Hurricane Center says, okay, here we go, then it's when I'll put it out. But I know with Irma, by the time Irma made landfall, I was so sleep deprived I had typed up a list of storms and statistics I was going to tweet out when it made landfall the night before, and had these various thresholds. If it hits this, and it sets this record, and then it basically set my alarm to wake up every hour until the storm made landfall.
Phil, I got one more question for you. I know we're coming in on the time that you need to leave. And for everyone who's listening right now, we have Dr. Phil Klotzbach on from Colorado State University talking about the tropical season. Phil, one thing that we experienced last year, it was the first really active hurricane season that affected the United States in the age of Twitter and Facebook and social media. What are your takeaways from that, where we see all these scary 15-day hurricane forecast / snow the snow forecast, hurricane forecast? What are your takeaways with this first active year on social media per se with the hurricane season last year?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely would agree. I mean, if we had Twitter in 2005 or 2004, it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened then too. I mean, I think, we had a lot of people that hadn't really had too much in the way of hurricane activity until last year. Because even in 2012 with Sandy, that was kind of a hybrid storm. And Twitter still wasn't quite the player it was last year. And I think, I think having Twitter is super helpful, and Facebook and things is super helpful because you can get information from some of these island countries very quickly out, and pictures and things that would have taken a lot longer otherwise. But I think also, there's a lot of data that's out there, and it's important to understand the goods and the bads of it. Like 10-day model forecasts, typically don't have they have very little skill. And I mean, the data's out there because these models will run that far, but it's important to kind of know what you're looking at and not, get fired up about a 10-day forecast and things. But certainly, after Harvey last year, obviously after we saw what Harvey did with the rains and the winds and everything, it really got people really ramped up. And it was like right away, Irma was forming, and Irma always looked bad. Like it always just looked like it was going to take a track that was going to take it towards the Caribbean and then probably towards the U.S. So I think, we had so much hype for Irma that by the time it actually hit Florida, I thought be inundated with interviews that day, but hardly did any. I think everyone was so burned out on the storm before it even hit that the interest in the storm was higher like 2 or 3 days before it hit them when the storm actually made landfall. And obviously with Irma, while it was a horrible, horrible storm, we dodged a huge bullet with Irma. I'm just going to share one last thing here because I think this slide is fascinating.
I was going to say Cuba helped out with Irma. Just at the last minute, the mountain range of Cuba really took a bite out of it. Yeah, so there was one other thing I was going to show too that I think really this is from the Hurricane Center as well. Let's see, is my screen shared? Can you see it? Not yet, but
let me see.
As soon as it comes up, I'll lock you in.
All right. Okay, let me try again. All righty.
That's it.
Cool. All right. So this is one. So as you mentioned, Irma, basically Cuba definitely took a chunk out of the storm, and it got hit by some shear and dry air. But another thing that really spared us with Irma was, so the track of the storm was about 30 miles further east than what the forecast was 1 day in advance, which is still a really good forecast. But because of that, you can see the storm surge inundation, what it would have been in places like Naples and Fort Myers versus what it was. Because the storm tracked to the east of Naples and went inland there and started to weaken, as opposed to going west further up the coast, making landfall north of Fort Myers, saved a huge amount of storm surge because part of Fort Myers and Naples could very well have been underwater, just a very slight storm track shift. So while Irma was certainly devastating in the Florida Keys and obviously did huge amounts of damage in the Caribbean and in Cuba, Florida certainly was significantly impacted by Irma, but it was not as bad as it could have been had the storm tracked just a little further west. And so when you have these storms tracking parallel to a coastline, very subtle storm shifts can cause big differences in what the impacts are.
Yeah, in fact, that was the difference between having a major surge versus negative surge in some of these spots too. So that was,
yeah.
I mean, went from one to the other. And I remember I was doing some discussion about it in some live chat and mentioned this could happen. If it tracks further inland, you may be looking at negative surge. But we certainly learned a lot from Irma, and also hats off to the NHC for getting their track successful. I mean, they had a really successful track guidance last year. I mean, if you want to maybe mention that as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, the forecast tracks, every year the forecast tracks get better. I mean, it seems like every year they're breaking records for track predictions, 1, 3, 5 days. And I think, I forget what the stat is, but it's something like the forecast 5 days is what it was, say 3 days, 15 years ago or something. And it seems like every year they're breaking records, and the intensity forecasts are getting better too. There's still challenges with predicting rapid intensification events, but they really are certainly improving. So hopefully, with improved model guidance, hopefully those will continue to improve for the future, but hopefully we won't see as many rapid intensifiers this year.
Yeah.
Okay, Scotty, I've got nothing else if you want to.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds great, Phil, and we know you've got to run. So I know in your presentation you was able to share your social media accounts. If you want to do that one more time, we'd love to give you that.
Yeah, I'll just put it up. Let's see, right now.
All right. So there it is. And Phil, we really do appreciate your time with us tonight. And maybe we can have you come back on as we wrap up the season in November and kind of talk about what actually did transpire over the last over the hurricane season.
Sounds good. You can throw eggs at me or tomatoes at me if things don't turn out the way I was saying.
No pillory for you, not yet.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Phil. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, that was a great presentation there. And Shay, I know you and Jared and Ashley, even you with being along the coastline, very useful information. And I know we always, like Ashley talked about, it only takes one storm to kind of ruin your life or your belongings and stuff. But it kind of looks like it's going to be a little bit calmer this year than it was last year.
Hopefully so. Yeah, that graphic you showed with Irma, even with that storm being 350 miles away, we still felt some pretty significant storm surge from that storm. I mean, you factor 2 to 3 feet on top of any kind of perigee spring tide that we have ongoing already, along with any little bit of sea level rise that we've had. And you know, we're starting to just have more and more flooding in this area. So storms even far away can still have a major impact here. And we learned that from Irma last year. So we're not as well protected as we used to be, even from storms like storms that are all the way down the tip of Florida. So that's something to take away from this. You know, it's really important, really key to remember that if you don't feel the winds, it's not there. Well, we're going to feel it one way or another. So I don't know if Jared has anything to add to that. He had some pretty good stats from Irma and what the tide tables. I think I was up in the mountains, Scotty, near you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shay, you were in the mountains. I was on the second floor holding on for dear life. And the thing that was interesting about Irma, it wasn't just the high tides. I mean, we did it again, a top 3 tide in the Charleston Harbor. It was it fell short of 10 feet. It was a 9.97, something like that. I mean, really a technicality that we fell short of 10 feet. And again, that storm, I mean, it was all the way in the Gulf. You know, it was kind of like a reverse Joaquin, in that this time it was well to the west versus well to the east, but we still got that predecessor rain event in there. And we cannot forget with Irma, we can't forget the tornadoes. There were 4 tornadoes from Irma and many more warnings that came out of that. That was a very stressful day for a lot of people. A lot of people were going into the tornado shelters once, twice, 3 times that day for those quick spin ups. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you get those kinds of situations, and then you get into October and you get fronts that are getting into the area, it makes predecessor rain events just that much more prevalent, for sure. As far as outlooks, I use them as an indicator of just how much Xanax are the meteorologists going to need to get through the season. And it's encouraging in one sense that, you know, we may not see the Cape Verde kind of things, but as Scotty alluded to, the homegrown storms, those are the kinds of things that just sneak up right up on you. Gaston in 2004, went to bed that night, there was nothing out there. Woke up the next morning, my car was under 6 feet of water, and it was a hurricane, or it was a tropical storm posthumously upgraded to a hurricane. So, those homegrown storms, yeah, I mean, that's serious business.
That's a great point, Jared, that you talk about that. With hurricanes, a lot of people, the first thing that pops in their mind is the wind, and those homegrown systems may not have the crazy wind speeds, but what we've seen here, Ashley, you've seen in Texas, Charleston, what you guys have seen down there, Shay and Jared, is these homegrown systems bring in a lot of rain and a lot of flash flooding potential, and that, for us, I believe in our part of the world, in the Western Carolinas, we don't really have to worry about the wind per se, but even those homegrown systems, they bring some flooding potential. So that's something you always have to watch for.
And keeping in mind too, Scotty, that just because it might be a 50 or 60 mile an hour tropical system, you still get those gusts. In any other case, they'd be issuing severe thunderstorm warnings. Exactly. And so you can still get tree damage. You get a lot of that water in there. It's going to loosen up the roots, and even a 40 mile an hour gust at that point is going to bring trees and power lines down. So, these homegrown systems they're a pain in the butt. That's to put it mildly.
And they also, like Jared, you were alluding to, they're very capable of producing those quick spin up tornadoes as well.
Yeah. We saw that with Nate, and and we know that very well on this program, having me, James, and Scotty was working it for Foothills Weather Network. I mean, that was very serious. That ended up being a very serious outbreak.
We had 8 tornadoes up here in western North Carolina and South Carolina.
Yeah, you're in Tornado Alley up there. Not many people know there is a sort of an alley up through the mountains, and just off the tip of the Piedmont up to the base of the mountains there's this nice little breeding ground for tornadoes. They're hard to follow. They're hard to chase because you've got lots of hills, trees, windy roads, dangerous spots you don't want to stop. I mean, if you ever drive in the mountains, you never want to pull off the side of the road anywhere because it's just so dangerous. I mean, yeah.
You're exactly right, Shay. They're normally wrapped in precipitation, numerous trees, and just not ideal areas to chase tornadoes at all.
I mean, between Silva and Cashers, what was the road? There's nowhere to pull off. Let's just say if you're pulling off, you're going down the side of the mountain. So, yeah, I mean, it's very treacherous that way for sure.
Yeah, and these storms nowadays, for those who are just jumping on, or joined in the last few minutes. Dr. Phillip Klotzbach was on with us earlier. He had to leave at about 8:45. So we're continuing on for some wrap-up discussion on the tropics on the show. And one topic we didn't bring up tonight was Hurricane Harvey, which was in Ashley's neck of the woods. And just seeing how these storms are dumping massive amounts of rain, more than we've ever seen. That I wouldn't say that's going to be the new trend going forward, but it could be a cursor of things to watch. If we see that the storm's going to slow down as it approaches the coastline, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, coming along the Gulf Coast, lots of moisture comes up from the Gulf, especially if it's in train with the subtropical jet. You get a lot of intensive rainfall, and there was just a massive amount, 4 feet of rain where you live, Ashley?
Yeah, south. We only got a few inches, but that's what I was going to comment on was the gradient with these storms, just like they were talking about with the rise in ocean with Irma. It was the same with Harvey. We had only a county or two away that got 15 plus inches. So with us trying to make decisions, we're either going to get 4 inches or 16. Well, that's quite a bit. And then to comment too on rapid intensification, nobody thought Harvey was going to be a Cat 4. Most of the models were pointing tropical storm, low end Cat 1. And then all of a sudden that Friday or that Thursday right before, it just sprung up because the temperatures were so warm down there. So I would say Harvey's a great example of rapid intensification as well.
And Ashley, with you in the EM world, we were talking about the tropical season. What are you guys doing? How are you guys getting prepared for it in your area?
So because I live so far inland, tropical season is always going to mean flooding and flash flooding, just like the little mini system that just came in. It wasn't a tropical storm or anything, but because it was bringing so much moisture and storms through our area, we're always concerned about flooding here. We live in Flash Flood Alley. So we're going to basically run our drills and educate the public on turning around, not drowning. So if we have low water crossings that need to be closed, we tell them, hey, you need to turn around. We push a lot of that on social media. We're going to be checking our rescue teams, giving them extra training for the boat teams. I think Austin Fire Department might have sent a team down south today to the coast for some of that moisture and flooding they're having down there today. So we're always getting our training in and being prepared more for the flooding and for activation if we need to send them down to the coast again as a resource. So that's kind of what we're doing with that.
Well, I'll tell you what, as far as evacuations go, Florida definitely got their practice last year. I'm still just severely concerned about South Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, that the whole heading west, north to south seems to do a little bit better on 995 to South Carolina, but we're still only 4 lanes on our interstates. And we're just so far behind. We had, I always think of Hurricane Floyd back, Jared remembers the evacuation for Hurricane Floyd. And back then, we're talking 3 times the population now as it was then. And it was bumper to bumper. People sat in traffic for 24 hours. I mean, the nightmare stories are out there, but in every town, every state has its definite problems with evacuations, but that's a huge concern. I mean, you have a lot of more people living on the coast now. So if you do live on the coast, have a plan. I mean, if you feel like it's time to leave, then listen to that. I thought our Governor Haley did a great job evacuating for Irma, or she called for about 5 days early, or was that Irma, Jared? I'm sorry.
No, that was Matthew. Yeah. There was no evacuation of Charleston for Matthew. For Irma. See, now I'm doing it.
Right. But she started about the process about 4 or 5 days out, and logistically speaking, it was a good call because you got to get the rust off of the wheels, right? It had been so long since we've done an evacuation exercise, full-on evacuation exercise. So it takes so much time, so many logistics, so many things in play, and it costs a lot of money too. So they got to make the right call. But just pay attention to what the forecasters are saying for the upcoming season, whatever's going on. Make smart decisions. Have a plan. Have your hurricane kit. And I can't stress enough to make sure that whatever you do stays safe. And if you live in a flood-prone zone, I wouldn't wait till the last minute because then you may not be able to get out at all. I'll pass it back to you, to the rest of the crew here to chime in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add with the whole evacuation thing, the state of Texas actually has a model. So they can actually model how long it'll take Houston to evacuate. So they run that model and they kind of have an idea. I think it takes at least 3 days So that's another thing with rapid intensification. If you have something spring up within 24 hours, you're not evacuating people because you're going to have people stuck on the roads, you know, and stuck there, can't move. And we don't want people in their cars with hurricane coming in and everything else. So that's a big deal. And they run drills for that too. And then that's another thing I forgot to add. We prepare for that evacuation up here because we open shelters for the coast people when they come up north. So we're a part of the state plan for them to kind of come up the interstate and kind of stop off at Austin and other areas to shelter there. So that's another thing we have to be prepared for in case we have a big storm like Harvey.
All right, guys. Well, it's about 9 o'clock. Do you all have tweets? I know we didn't do tweets of the week last week. Does anybody have any pulled up? Or do we
want to jump in? I want to do one more thing on the preparedness that Shay and Ashley have talked about. The most important thing you can do, a lot of places have now moved to the idea of evacuation zones, and so South Carolina EMD has the coastal areas sliced out into evacuation zones. So the best thing that you can do is know your zone. If your state emergency manager is going to have everything on their website for that. In fact, just tweak the zones for 2018. Know where your evacuation zone is. Know when it's going to be called. They went to this in like 2004, and it just got used for the first time in 2015. Went pretty well. So, but know that zone. Keep abreast of those changes, and I think it's going to, and you're going to be just fine.
That's right. Know your zone, know where to go, know what to have. And if you need a refresher on what you need to put in your kit, your hurricane kit, back in May, we had Cheryl Nelson on our show, and she gave a rundown of what to include in those kits. And look up that show and listen to it, and make sure that your kits are all ready to go just in case it was to happen. So with that, Shay, Ashley, Jared, do you guys have a tweet?
I'm trying to find mine.
I know. I'm looking for one now too. I didn't plan on it tonight, so I'm hunting one.
I've got one. I'll go ahead and do mine first then, and I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to find yours. So this was last Thursday. This was just in the just north of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. This was over Lake Norman, outside of Mooresville, North Carolina. This was a microburst that was excellently captured on the terminal Doppler at the Charlotte airport. And as you watch it play there, you can kind of see the colors, the green and the reds moving away from each other. In that area, there was numerous reports of downed trees and power lines and all kinds of wind damage. But that to me was a very classic sign of a splat from a microburst that happened in just north of Lake Norman late last week. So I'm using my own tweet for tweet of the week. I don't know if that's good or not. I don't know if that's allowable, but that's what I'm doing.
That's funny, Scotty, because I have one of my tweeting one of my own as well. This right here, I was just talking to Scotty about this before the show, where we're out on Sullivan's Island, and some of us do some kiteboarding out there, and there was some storms coming from inland. You could hear the thunder, and I put up all my gear and was going back to the car. Other people were starting to fold up their gear, but there were still people out on the water. And, there's always this feeling like this storm is far enough. The thunder's pretty far away. Not too worried about it. But this particular storm cell was unique because you can see all the lightning bolts surrounding it. And these bolts are miles outside of the storm, which where you would normally see blue sky. So we call this bolt out of the blue. And this one particular one cracked right out over the beach just after I got off the beach. Hopefully, I think it forced most of those people off the water right away when they saw it because they weren't expecting it. But just another reminder that these storms during the summertime and storms in general, they can go out to 30 miles. So you want to be very careful. Just because the storm's not overhead does not mean that lightning cannot strike you. In fact, this type of lightning bolt out of the blue claims lives every year, more so in Florida than anything else, but still very, very dangerous. So that was my tweet of the week. Just wanted to put that out there for educational purposes, that be aware if storms are heading your way, I would clear out of the water no matter what. Okay, I think Jared's next, right?
Yeah, I can be next. I can do that, and I'm going to do James's on his behalf. He's had to step back. He is having just a wonderful evening with technology. So thanks to James for pulling together what he can. I know that he's been struggling, but this one, this is going to piggyback off Shay. This is a couple days. This is the same night, the night of the 15th, and then so Kevin Klosel, Texas Embassy, big on event safety. Great follow on this. Great photo. I mean, hey, you can't. I mean, that's a beautiful picture of lightning bolts and a bunch of people at a baseball game outside, surrounded by metal things. What could possibly go wrong? But noted that the lightning was way too close. 3 cloud-to-ground strikes within 5 miles, and I was downtown, and I heard the thunder from one of those. It sounded like a bomb went off. And so I found this very interesting because you don't want to. If you're within 5 miles. You got to clear out. I know, Scotty, I'm sure you have plenty of experience with this, with your race day consulting, you and Ricky. And, it just continues to reiterate the point that there is a very interesting, almost like we're just kind of playing with fire here a little bit, and that we're just hoping that nothing goes wrong. But it could. I mean, you had CG within a mile there, and you can see the ring. The first graphic there is the ring around the location of Joe Riley Park in downtown Charleston. There were a lot of cloud-to-ground lightning strikes that night. That was a very busy night. There was severe thunderstorms inland there. So, so
Jared,
something to think about.
Jared, the last sentence of Kevin's tweet, which, Kevin, if you're watching, we still want to get you on the show. But unfortunately, like you talked about, and he's talking about, apparently something really bad is going to have to happen before the rules are changed. And I don't want to throw off on the Charleston River Dogs because I do work with minor league baseball in Hickory with their consulting. And when the players are out before the game, the team has control. But as soon as the umpires walk on that field, it is up to the umpires to control the game. And so it's to their discretion of when to stop the game and when not to stop the game. So, this is something that's going to have to come from minor league baseball and major league baseball before we see anything.
Yeah, umpires need to figure out balls and strikes before and get meteorology degrees.
That's right.
I've got James.
Or just give control over to a meteorologist who's on site and let them make that call.
Yeah, I like baseball. Hint, hint. I got James's up as well, real quick. And so James comes to us with if you need a good reason not to exercise or do yard work today, you got it. And this is from WTOC. This comes out of Savannah, but first alert: he may impact outdoor afternoon exercise yard work plan. So, honey, couldn't blow on. Heat advisory in effect. WTOC told me not to. John Weatherby and the gang said nope, no weather, so no going outside. So kind of fun there. Yeah, we've had quite the heat wave. We had heat indices in Charleston get to 110, 111 in a couple spots immediately after the sea breeze passage today. Hottest day of the year at 97, and that looks to continue for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I wonder how many wives wrote into the weather or to the news station there and said, "What? My husband's got to be out here doing the yard work."
Hey, heat advisory. You gotta listen. You gotta listen, man.
Or on that last picture from James, Carrie Hilliard's got to go in there to have tea. There's a sponsorship.
Yeah, no kidding.
There's the little ad there. All right, Ashley.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow the trend of using my own tweet. So we have these great river trails around where I live. Like I said, we kind of live in hill country in Texas where we have a lot of rivers, streams, and flash flooding. So I like to take a hike on these trails, and I noticed that there's a huge tree growing in the middle of this river, which is a little lower than normal because we haven't gotten a lot of precipitation lately. But this is a huge problem because if we do get a flash flood event, we do not want vegetation or anything in the middle of these rivers because it hurts the flow of the river. So basically a really good mitigation project would be to go in there and unfortunately remove the vegetation and the tree from that. But it would hopefully reduce flooding, but also basically avoid the tree floating downriver and causing any harm with what could happen with a flood. So this is my plug for mitigation projects, because we want to prevent the disaster before it actually happens.
And that is a big problem here in Western North Carolina. There is a lot of just trees and debris and everything in our area, lakes and streams and rivers from all of the flooding. And it's only going to cause issues when we have the next heavy rainfall event.
Exactly.
And all of that, Jared or James, I wish we had some breaking weather news. One of the, breaking weather music or something like that. While we were talking, a flash flood warning has been issued for the Greensboro metropolitan area. This goes until midnight. 2 inches of rain has already fallen over the city, and another 1 to 2 inches of rain is expected. As you can see, this is a thunderstorm that stalled out in the Greensboro area between Interstate 40 and Interstate 85, and has already produced over 2 inches of rain, and up to another inch or two is possible in that area. So if you are traveling between Winston-Salem and Raleigh tonight through Greensboro, watch out for some flash flooding in that area. We will, if you're listening to us, we'll continue to monitor that, and I'm sure James will be on it with our Weather Camera Network, and we'll get some video streaming of the Greensboro area with possible flash flooding. So,
geez, Scotty, I'm looking at that thing, and I see Urban Heat Island written all over it, or would it be a derecho?
No, those are both two show topics we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about those two show topics. We just got to line up some guests for that. So speaking of that, next week we have the Sirens Project on. This is a group of guys out of Atlanta, Georgia. They go storm chasing with their drones. And so they're going to be talking to us next week about their adventures out in the Midwest and talking about the storm chasing and all of the information and data they get from that. And then the next week we're off for the 4th of July. And then we come back and we talk about volcanoes with Dr. Janine Kreipner from Concord University. And then on the 18th of July, something we've already talked about tonight, we're going to be talking about tropical tornadoes with Roger Edwards from the Storm Prediction Center. So that's a look at the next 3 shows here for the Carolina Weather Group. As always, if you have any show recommendations or folks you want to bring on the show, please reach out to us, and we'll do our best to get those folks on. So guys, before we close out, any closing words or thoughts? All right, well, I see all of shaking heads, so we'll go ahead and close out tonight. We hope you have a great rest of the week. Stay cool out there wherever you are. Big heat wave continues on for the southeast and much of the south, and goodness, for a good portion of the east coast. So stay cool out there, and we will see you back here next Wednesday night. For everyone, I am Scotty Powell with the Carolina Weather Group. Have a great evening.